Hello everyone, and welcome to our Distinguished Visitor Lecture Series here in the Faculty of Law. I'm Deborah Parks, and I'm a faculty member, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Anne McGilvray, who is going to in turn introduce our speaker for today. Professor McGilvray has been teaching here for I don't know how many years now, but a few anyway, and is a nationally and internationally known expert on children's rights. And she teaches a course, among other courses, on children in the law. And I believe our distinguished visitor, Dr. Covell, will also be participating in the children's rights class today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McGilvray.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Katherine Covell to you. I've known about her work for a much longer time than I've known Katherine, which has been a while. She is Professor of Psychology and Executive Director of the Children's Rights Centre at Cape Breton University in Nova Scotia. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of the scope of what she does. She represents North America on the International NGO Council on Violence Against Children. She represented the Canadian NGO community at the UN Special Session on Children and Youth in 2001-2, which was a mega thing. She presented Canada's NGO report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2003. She was lead researcher on the United Nations Global Study on Violence Against Children for North America in 2005. Her CV is like yards long, so I just picked out a few things I thought were kind of neat. But she met with the Royal Government of the Kingdom of Bhutan this year to talk about the economics of well-being and happiness. Now, if I had that on my CV, I'd be... That's awesome. She's met with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs on violence against the girl child, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child at Geneva, the Preparatory Committee for the UN General Assembly Special Session on Children, as a member of the Canadian delegation, that is the formal delegation as opposed to the NGO delegation, and among many, many others. In her advocacy for children's rights, in every area associated with what I think is the most outside of outsider law, Dr. Covell has written and spoken about poor children, girl children, criminalized children, abused children, working children, miseducated children, exploited children, toxins in children, children's emotions, and children's understanding of war, violence, international conflict, and parental anger. Her published works run into the hundreds of titles, including 5 books on children's rights, 2 of which I've used over the years in my own courses. Her forthcoming book is called Education in the Best Interests of the Child. Clearly, her work centers on children's human rights education and the implications of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child for the development of children. She has collaborated extensively with schools in Canada and the UK to develop and implement rights education, and of course has written extensively on rights-based curricula and teaching children's rights. That children have any rights comes as a surprise to a lot of people. That children have equal rights is highly resisted. Children were in law, and until fairly recently, property, for centuries and centuries property of the father, for a while property of parents. Now they're nobody's property because they are recognized rights bearers in the courts and at international law. However, much contemporary rhetoric, including, to our own shame, rhetoric of the courts and of lawyers in Canada, treats children, or at least is tainted with notions of children as property. So there's a long way to go for law schools and for children's education and for the public to understand what it means to be a rights bearer as opposed to something that belongs to somebody and that's nobody else's business, which is what childhood still is for a lot of children. The other thing about children's rights is that they are not just theoretical notions of equality. They are deeply embodied in children and embedded in the conditions of childhood. Respect for children's rights is what makes or breaks human development. It is a simple, profound, and powerful shift in how we think about what it means to be human. One thing all children do share across the world, though, is education, which is a right of the child and a duty of the state, and this is what Katherine is here to talk to us about today. So thank you, Katherine.
Thank you, Anne. Now I know why I'm so tired. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. One of the things I do when I'm traveling around is read people's T-shirts, and one of my recent travels, I saw this on a little boy's T-shirt. And I thought, how true, that for so many children, to use the scientific terminology, schools suck. And it's really ironic because children can't wait to be old enough to learn to read and to be old enough to go to school. But things change rather quickly, don't they? Once they get to school, the excitement fades. Their joy in learning is taken from them. There's endless, boring rote exercises. There's inexplicable rules. And there's a whole wealth of practices that we've known for over 100 years are antithetical to learning. Writing in 2010, Martin Habermas, who unfortunately died this year, describes how little teacher practices have changed over the past few decades. I love this quote. He points out that the only change in behavior in teachers that he's observed is that they now ask their students to use Google. Other than that, nothing's changed. And so what happens is the children become disengaged, they become restless, they fall asleep in class, they act out their frustration, and the teachers get burned out, and then they become more ineffective and more punitive, and the children act out more and get more disengaged and fall asleep more quickly. And so what have we done to change things? Well, generally we've adopted the Stephen Harper approach, and we've tried to make our schools into jails. We have on-site police officers. I was recently at a school near where I live, and I was talking to the principal, and the bell rang for break, and the doors opened, and out came a huge police officer in full uniform and gun to greet the children as they came for their 10-minute class break. We have sniffer dogs to search lockers for evil substances. Can't trust kids. We have metal detectors to make sure kids don't bring anything into school. It's terribly hard on children who have braces. And we have no touching policies. And if you think that looks exaggerated, we had last year in Nova Scotia some children suspended from school because the school had a no touching policy and they were making snow angels in the winter. These sort of practices don't just violate common sense, they violate children's fundamental human rights, the rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and in particular their education rights under the Convention. The CRC, which I'm going to use for Convention, has specific education rights that address the content of school curricula, the appropriate teaching methods, and the appropriate school practices, especially discipline practices. And were these rights respected, they would change school practices and change school cultures in ways that would sustain children's engagement and improve their learning. So what I'm going to talk about is an example of children's human rights education that is completely convention consistent, which is very rare, and the effects it has on teachers and children. And I'm going to try and summarize a decade's worth of research into half an hour if I can. So I'll give you a chance to ask questions. So what I'm talking about is a model of children's rights education that has been underway in Hampshire County in southern England. It's the little pink blob there. That's where it is. And that's been underway since 2002. The program is called Rights, Respect and Responsibility. And the responsibility was put there to get teacher buy-in, not because they were actually teaching it overtly. With help from SSHRC, my partner and I, Brian Howe, have been really privileged to assess the implementation of the program, the effects of the program, and the growth of the program over the last decade. As she started, as I said, in 2002, and we started with 18 schools, there are now over 500, which is much of Hampshire County. It is actually the largest education authority in England. For those of you who don't know, Hampshire County is the home of the New Forest. It's where you get those picture postcard little villages with the thatched roof and the wild ponies, but it's not all like that. Right? The top left there is a pointer here, never mind. The top left is one of the schools we were at. Every class had a little garden plot in the back, and what you had there were decorations. Apparently the previous year they had made scarecrows for each of their garden plots, but they thought they weren't pretty enough. So this year they made prettier things. And the kids at the bottom there under that picture would be the sort of advantaged children who attend schools like that. But Hampshire also has its high poverty schools, and it also has a lot of very disadvantaged children. So we have the RRR program going in all of these kinds of schools. So the program actually started with us. We started one in Cape Breton, and a group of Hampshire administrators came over to study with us. And they took back the idea, and what they managed to do when they went back is something no one else, to my knowledge, has done, and that was they got government support. So they actually got funding from the British Ministry of Education to systematically implement rights-consistent education over a 3-year period. And that kind of government education partnership I've not seen anywhere else, and I think it's been a real facilitator to success. So I just start by summarizing the characteristics of the RRR program and then its outcome. I think the most important thing to know about it is that it's a comprehensive whole school approach. You know, it's not just teaching kids that they have rights and here are the rights of the convention. It's actually restructuring the schools so that the rights of the convention become both the organizing framework for the school and the values framework for the school. So everything within the school is rights consistent. And because of that, what it succeeds in doing is teaching the 3 essential components of human rights education, which are generally considered rights rights about education, rights through education, and rights for education. I'm doing it all backwards, see? That's what you do when you're jet lagged. Let me do that again. Knowledge about rights, rights, I'm going to just go on. You'll see. It's easier. Teaching about rights. Okay, that's what I was trying to get at, yeah. And again, I want to really stress that rights are not just taught as a separate subject. They're integrated into everything the children are learning. This slide was from an information technology class. So they're learning how to do PowerPoint here, and they're learning it by putting together a PowerPoint, probably doing better than I am, on rights in the convention. We watched them learning about rights in science. They were learning about microorganisms. So what they did was they learned how children's rights are violated if there are microorganisms in their water. So they look at rights to clean water, rights to health, and they also looked at government priorities and why governments weren't spending money making sure children had clean water and all those kind of things. There was rights in social studies. There's rights integrated into everything. Just give you a couple of examples. One of my favorite examples with younger children, when they're doing the story of Cinderella, they're asked afterwards to talk about Cinderella, and I have a couple of quotes from the children. One says, the stepmother and her sisters were really horrible to Cinderella. They kept her in a cellar and they made her work like a slave, and that infringed her Article 19 right to be protected from being hurt or being badly treated. And then a little girl says, yeah, and her stepmother denied her right to be protected from abuse and Article 31, because kids have a right to play and they didn't let her go to the ball. So that's the way they learn the rights. They're thinking critically and they're generalizing. I also wanted to share with you this poem one of the children had written in an English class. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. It's obviously a take on Martin Luther King, but it was a very small child, so I don't know, maybe a 9 or 10-year-old. So, rights in everything, in all subjects. And Explicit teaching about the rights of the Convention is also done by having posters about rights and information about rights throughout the school. So the library, for example, would have, you have a right to access information. I'll just give you a few examples. Where am I? Right. Classroom, there's posters all over the walls on different rights and about the program. There's posters in the hallways. And they usually link rights with behaviors like this, but the emphasis is always actually on the right. Rights posters in the cafeteria, and so on. The other thing they do is at the beginning of each year, the children draw up a charter of rights based on the convention in discussion with the teacher. This is from a group of 7-year-olds, so they decided they wanted to, instead of signing on, because every child has to agree to the charter, but instead of signing on, they decided to make their faces and use their faces. But they do these, and then they use what they have up there as behavior management throughout the year. So if somebody's misbehaving, the teacher will refer to the rights in the Charter of Rights, the classroom Charter of Rights, or sometimes the children will refer to the Charter of Rights. So we were there one day and a little boy started fussing around and the little girl next to him said, "Would you stop that? You're interfering with my right to learn. You take a time out." And he said, "Oops, okay." And he went and sat in the corner. Never seen anything like it. My very favorite charter, part of a charter, this was from a school. It was actually a separate school for children who have very serious behavior disorders. And you can see the way they have interpreted no bullying, no fighting, and so forth. It's having kind hands and feet. I thought that was absolutely lovely. This was a group of 7-year-olds really seriously challenged with behavioral issues. So that gives you an example of the very explicit teaching of rights, what the actual rights of the convention are. So the second is teaching the skills, so teaching through rights, okay? And the skills here are taught by respecting the rights the children are being taught that they have. So the teaching styles are democratic, the children have a lot of input into what they're learning, and teaching styles are all evidence-based. So instead of a lot of rote learning and memorization, the sort of thing you have is widespread use of role play, a lot of cooperative group learning and group discussion, and widespread opportunities for really meaningful participation in all aspects of the school functioning, in classroom materials, in how things are learned, in development of basic skills and so forth. I'll just give you a couple of examples quickly. We went into one, they start at 3, 4 when they're in England. So went into one class of 4-year-olds who were learning how to use scissors. And typically, at least at the schools in Nova Scotia, when you learn how to use scissors, you're given a piece of paper and somebody's drawn something on it and you're told to cut on the line. These kids were, the goal was that they learn how to use scissors. So they were allowed, because of participation, to pick from some options of what they wanted to cut and how they wanted to cut it. So we were going around asking the kids what they were doing, and this little 5-year-old looked at me and he picks up a piece of flowered material and he says, "I'm going to make my sister a dress." Another one, the kids were learning about the Second World War, and as a class they decided that the way they'd like to learn about it was to set up a museum. So they divided themselves up in terms of what they liked to do, and some of them did letters from children who'd been separated, talking about how their rights were violated. Some of them built model guns and equipment that had been used in the war. Some of them found old souvenirs from their grandparents, and so on and so on. And they put together this war museum, and then they invited somebody from the community to come in and judge it. It was amazing. The excitement was just phenomenal. Whereas here, I don't know about Manitoba, but in Nova Scotia, when you learn about the Second World War, you get to memorize dates and battles. I think these kids learned a lot more. Children are on every school committee. There's some representation of a child. Budget committees, hiring committees, all of them. And I know Anne's favorite example, I think, a 5-year-old who was on a committee to hire a new person. They call them dinner ladies, which is not at all politically correct, but they have typically women who come into the school at noon to serve the children lunch, to prepare lunch and serve it to the children. So the school was needing a new dinner lady, and the 5-year-old, it was a young school, preschool. The 5-year-old was on the hiring committee, and so she was asked to give her questions to the dinner lady, and she had 3. Do you like kids? Are you a good cook? Do you shout? I thought those were the 3 most relevant questions throughout the entire interview process. I mean, that sums it up. So they can do it, given the opportunity. The skills that they're developing through participating and by being treated with respect and so forth are skills that promote the development of effective citizenship and also of a human rights respecting culture, which I think is what we all ultimately want. The third component is teaching for rights. Children are encouraged to take action to promote and to protect the rights of others. And they do this. They have anti-bullying programs. They themselves work on buddy systems. Some of them have invited local politicians into the school and interrogated them on why they aren't more rights respecting generally, and so on. They also work helping other kids who need help. So what we did was a variety of measures, surveys, interviews, focus groups, and so forth, and the initial data we got showed a few things that were kind of interesting. In terms of teachers, one of the things we found that was kind of interesting was that the burnout rates were lowered. And this is important because teacher burnout has become almost a global problem, certainly in the industrialized world. And when teachers are burnt out, they're much less effective and they're much less empathetic to their students. So we had measured teacher burnout, happy at the end. The red is schools that had fully implemented the rights program. And what we found was if you looked at the child participation rates over time, so you see the child participation is gradually going up in the rights respecting schools, that turned out to predict the teachers' lowered burnout, primarily through a sense of personal achievement. So the more the children were participating in the classroom, the lower the teachers' burnout rates. And the participation just sort of continued to increase. And we had a lot of teachers who'd been quite horrified at the thought of allowing more participation in classroom decision-making and in teaching, but ultimately came up with this, I think, sort of summarizes what the effects were on the teacher burnout. So what we were seeing was a much nicer atmosphere between teachers and children, right? The teachers were feeling more respected, and the children were feeling more respected because they were being allowed to participate. In terms of the children, there were some huge differences over time. Among the most obvious were the change in behaviors. It was understanding that they all had rights was reflected in much more positive behaviors. And they quickly seemed to apprehend that if they wanted their rights respected, they had to respect the rights of other children. And so we get this huge increase in the socially responsible behaviors, how inclusive they were to minority children, children with disabilities, more cooperative, decreased antisocial behaviors, and so on. Even the children noticed the difference, and I thought that was quite amazing. This was from a 5-year-old. We asked him about children's rights, and he said, "It's good because my friend was naughty before we learned about it, but now he behaves." So they got it. And what they started to do was just sort of use the discourse of rights to settle their differences, as in the example I gave you earlier. It's not that they all turned into little angels, but the differences were really clear. And one of the principals had said that after 2 years of the program, she threw out her behavioral incidents book because she didn't need it anymore. And that was the kind of thing we were getting. So the kids were gradually understanding that you have to do the right thing to respect other people's rights, even if it means such unpleasantness as picking up dead rats, because nobody really wants dead rats spinning around. So we got along with the behavior. Not surprisingly, if children's behavior is improving, they're probably going to be improving in terms of their cognition, more engagement, more confidence, the personal attributes that help children with learning, particularly the confidence, and a more adult-like understanding of children's rights. These were some of the comments when we asked them what they had learned about children's rights. I've learned to know when I'm disrespected and disrespectful. I thought was really good. Most important responsibility is to make sure everyone has their rights. Inequality and poverty are about the denial of human rights. These are 9 and 10-year-olds speaking. I just found that quite profound. So, not surprisingly, over time we see more and more confidence, more and more motivation to do well at school, more participation, and this, we go back to what we had at the beginning, not a hatred of school. It's not a place of torture now. It's, I like our school so much, I never want to leave because it's just so enjoyable. In fact, one of the teachers complained to us one day that the children had asked her if she wouldn't mind just not going home at night because they'd rather just stay at school than go home. These would be some of the kids in the disadvantaged areas. My favorite example of how much the kids were enjoying school came from one of the rural schools in the New Forest, actually, where a very strange thing happened after they introduced the RRR. And that was they had this phenomenal pregnancy rate. And in 2 years, this is a small school, but in 2 years there were 13 new babies. And none of us could figure out what was going on. But the children were getting very frustrated. And this is what one of them said. We said, what would you like to change about your school? Isn't that beautiful? If they just stopped taking maternity leave, everything would be okay. So what we had been seeing was a really transformed school culture, and the kids were getting to be more and more critical thinkers. They were making decisions about things, but they were making decisions about their behavior and their learning and so forth with regard to the convention. The rights, knowing that they had rights and then experiencing those rights really had a profound impact on them. So the findings I've whizzed through so far were pretty much as we had predicted, but somewhat better than we had hoped for. You always hope for the best. But other than that rash of pregnancies, there were some other things that really rather surprised us. And one was actually the extent of the effect on teachers. And this week, actually, they're having a 10-year celebration, and I've been getting emails from some of them talking about what a life-changing event it was, introducing rights-consistent schooling. So it really did have an effect on teachers. But the thing that we found most interesting and most rewarding was really the disproportionate effect on the disadvantaged children. And I really like this quote from an interview with a principal, because it really had changed the children. And it's not surprising in hindsight that it would have a disproportionate effect on disadvantaged children, but it wasn't something we had thought about at the beginning. So when we looked at the data over time, we noticed that in the disadvantaged schools, absences and behavioral incidents had decreased markedly. Test scores, motivation, self-regulation had increased significantly. And one school in particular stood out. I'll call it Woodview. It's not the real name. But as you can see from the demographics, this is an incredibly disadvantaged school in an incredibly disadvantaged neighborhood. Most of the families in this neighborhood are living with social assistance. They're in social housing. And it's just permeated with social difficulties. There's a lot of criminality. There's a lot of drug use. It sounds like my neighborhood in Cape Breton. And most of the kids had older siblings who were in jail or drug addicted or something. And these stats were at one particular year, but they actually didn't vary significantly at all over the time of study. So around the time that the RRR was being introduced, and Woodview was one of the first schools to have it introduced and be fully implemented, but this school was being considered for closure. It had become so awful. There were really high rates of absenteeism. There were really high rates of behavior problems and school failure. In fact, the behavior problems were so bad that the school kids had been banned from like the local community center, the local swimming pools, and that kind of thing. Make a long story short, the school has now been renovated and expanded. And the children were involved in all aspects of the renovation. They worked with the architects, the plumbers, the electricians. They chose the school colors. They chose a new uniform. They chose a new logo. And it's a fabulous school. How did we get that? Well, from 2002, when they started, to about 2005, when they decided not to close the school, you can see that there was a remarkable drop in the numbers of expulsions and in the scholastic achievement scores, or an increase in the scores, and a decrease in the expulsions. And it's continued, remarkably so. And it's really important to point out, as you're looking at those data, that the family profiles and the teachers remained constant. Okay, there were really no changes in teaching staff at the school and no changes in family demographics in the community. The results were so dramatic that the school ended up being visited by the number of British government officials, including the Minister of Children and Families, who after visiting the school and talking with the children said it was just inspirational, and she actually invited some of the children to go up to the House of Commons, and the principal took them up for a visit, which was quite wonderful. And everybody there seemed to agree that it was the changes that were brought about by the Children's Rights Education Program that changed the experiences, the motivations, and the aspirations of the students. Okay, to the point where actually last time we were there, the chief of police in that community told us that he was pushing for more widespread children's rights education as a means of reducing delinquency in the community, as he was so convinced of its effect. So the power of these data led us to wonder a couple more things, and that is, how would these kids do in their last year of elementary school compared to other kids? You know, it's one thing when you're little, but as you're getting older. And then would the changes last as they went through the normally difficult transition to junior high school? So to answer that first question, how are they doing in elementary school? Because we had been following 18 schools. So we isolated 3 schools. Oh, sorry, I didn't have it up there. We isolated 3 schools. Woodview, which was the one that we said had done so remarkably. We compared it with another one we'll call Riverview, which was similarly disadvantaged. It had exactly the same family profile, but they had not introduced the rights program. And then a very well-resourced school we'll call Hillside. Okay, so now we go to our findings. So compared to both the really advantaged, well-resourced school and the other poorer schools, the kids at Woodview reported higher levels of engagement, teacher support, participation, motivation, effort, the whole thing, all the positive things that you would want to see. So these are like the equivalent of our grade 6, grade 7. That's compared to both the other schools. And then if we look at the two disadvantaged schools, what we find is Woodview compared to the other disadvantaged schools showing better sense of self, fewer social problems that would be bullying, fighting at school, absenteeism, truancy, optimism about their futures, more commitment to stay in school longer. But absolutely incredible were the scores. So again, Woodview is our disadvantaged, Riverview is disadvantaged, Hillside is an advantaged school. So these are the kids who before the RRR were failing, right? So there's no difference between them and the advantaged on the math scores, no difference on the science scores, still not statistically significant difference on reading, writing, and overall English. And that these scores were not indistinguishable from a very advantaged group to a very disadvantaged group were quite incredible. So you see the Woodview kids have a demographic profile that's the same as the Riverview kids, but an academic profile that's the same as the Hillside kids. So what we then did was we followed two cohorts of kids from grade 7 through their first 2 years of junior high. And not surprisingly, because you know how neighborhoods stay the same, the kids from Woodview went into the most awful junior high school I've ever seen anywhere. The kids from Hillside went to one of the most beautiful junior high schools I've seen anywhere. The others were in the middle. And despite all that, Halcyon, which is the advantaged kids, this is over now 2 years later, they've been in junior high for 2 years. As you would expect, all of these variables are strongly linked with socioeconomic status. So these kids had the advantaged kids at the advantaged high school had the highest rates of parental involvement, highest rates of more healthy activities, and so forth. Shala, which is the Woodview, the disadvantaged schools, even more so than the advantaged kids, showed the highest levels of academic orientation and participation and the most positive social relationships. And the others were in the middle. So these are kids who have gone into this horrible school. The doors would lock in between like the administration offices and the classrooms. The chairs were broken. The library was closed down. Look at them. And we checked the data like 4 times, and I even had 2 different research assistants go over the analysis to make sure it was right, because we were sure it was backwards, but it actually wasn't. And when we talked to them, what we realized was they had taken with them from the elementary school this attitude is, we're all in it together, we can do it together because we have rights. And we just kept getting that from them. It was absolutely wonderful. If it wasn't for that program, I think these kids, like their older siblings, some of them would be pregnant, some of them would be in jails, some of them would be drug addicted and so forth, but they did really well. So that led us to conclude that, in fact, when you have a rights-consistent elementary school, you're not putting Band-Aids on kids' problems, but you're actually inoculating them in ways that promote resilience. So even though the school situation is adverse, the family situation remains adverse, these kids were still doing well. We have a couple of years to go yet to find out just how robust these findings are, because I think the key indicator of the robustness of the inoculation, if you will, is going to be how many of them graduate and go on to college. Last time we collected data from them, they were all still keen to do that, but we'll see. But in the meantime, we're absolutely convinced that when you do have schools that are consistent with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you do really promote engagement and resilience. And I think it works something like this. So you have the rights-respecting environment for the children, it makes sure that that environment is respectful in all directions and is also very supportive. That in turn increases the children's engagement in schooling. It increases their participation in schooling. That in turn increases their self-worth, their academic and social efficacy, and so you have resilience. I almost did it in the half hour. I want to end with some quotes from the children. We had a group of children, these ones are 12 to 15, that we talked to. Was the last thing we did last time we were in England, and we ended our discussion with them and we said, if you were going to tell people, or I should mention, these kids had only rights-consistent schooling since their first day at school, which was wonderful. So we said, if you were going to tell other people why it's important for children to have schools like yours where they learn about rights, what would you tell them? And one of them said, it's really hard to figure that out because I have no idea what school would be like without rights. But here's what the others said. I don't think it gets better than that. And I'll leave it at that and open questions.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation and lots for us to think about. So I want to open it up to questions. Because we have the video going, we'll have people on mic.
First of all, thanks for coming. I have many questions which I'll be emailing you later, but I'll limit myself to one or two. What role, if any, do you see of this rights-consistent education approach on a non-holistic basis? Because a lot of principals or administrators are going to respond by saying, this is too big, this is too expensive. Do you see some kind of role in schools that might be a little intimidated by a top-down approach, if you know what I mean?
When we started with some individual classrooms in Cape Breton, and we did get some very powerful effects. And I think with the younger children, if it's just in a particular preschool, there was the preschool in Abbotsford in British Columbia that did it and had tremendous effects. If it's in the early elementary years, then I think we anyway saw very strong effects. But I don't think that you're going to have as profound an impact because you're not going to be changing the culture or the climate of the school. It really requires a buy-in from everybody and strong school leadership to get the change. But what we found was in England, or what they found, was that once a couple of the preliminary bunch of schools who've done it, once other teachers started seeing the change in the children and the change in the scores, then they wanted to know how could they do it, what could they do, how could they change things. And it becomes kind of self-fulfilling after a while. You don't have to make that effort once you've got it done. So a lot of it is just a question of sitting down and looking at the school mandate, the school behavioral codes and so forth with the children. So I would say having some, if it's in the whole classroom, yes, you're going to have some positive effects. If what you do is add to citizenship education, hello boys and girls, you do have rights under Article 2. You are not to be discriminated against. That's going to be on the test. Now sit down and shut up. It won't have any good effect.
Hi, that really was a wonderful presentation. And my question has to do with the cost, because unlike a lot of change that people want to introduce that has technology, this one seems to be able to exist regardless of the people on the field or the building. So has a study been done of the expense?
Okay, interesting question. I think that the expense has been in terms of teachers. And what they did do was when they brought the group over to work with us, when they went back, one of those teachers was given the 3 years off teaching to go around to the schools and help other schools work on preparing their schools for adopting the program. So certainly her salary would be a cost. And they had a lot of workshops. They put on a lot of workshops for teachers because, I mean, clearly this necessitates appropriate teacher training in pedagogy and in the content of the convention, which teachers are not getting right now, right? But the costs were more around additional workshops for teachers and preparing teachers to make the changes. And then some teachers got a little bit of assistance for producing, for rewriting curricula so that they were incorporating rights. They also set up, I don't think there was any cost involved, but it really helped. They set up pods of, where teachers could get together and exchange resources and that kind of thing. But I think it's, as you said, compared to a lot of stuff, pretty cost-free. Yeah.
Hi there. Has there been any comparative studies done between schools that have gone with bring your own device and digital citizenship and schools that have gone rights education? Because currently in Pembrokeshire Trail School Division we're moving to a bring your own device environment, and because of that we're moving to what people are calling digital citizenship, which seems to be pretty much aligned with rights education. So I'd like to know if you have seen a difference between the two, or if that's ever been done.
I'm not familiar with the digital citizenship stuff, so I can't
Okay.
say.
Well, I'd like to speak to you later about doing that.
Yes, thank you for your very interesting presentation. This certainly seems like a very progressive approach, but on a downside, I was wondering if there's much parental opposition. Those who have followed these things are familiar with judicial cases in the United States, Canada, and Europe, where, if anything challenges, quote, traditional, close quote, views on sex, sexual orientation, and religion, some parents would complain it violates their rights. Will there be cases like that in this program also?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question. We were wondering if there would be any parental opposition, and so were the principals of the schools that were engaged. In fact, what we found was the opposite. Even locally, where we did it in the schools, and one of the teachers called me up and said that one of his parents had just phoned and said, have you started doing something different in the classroom because my kid's being more obedient than usual? And we looked into it, and it turned out, after talking to the child, that what was happening was the child had stopped arguing about going to bed because he realized he had a right to be healthy, and he knew that sleep was essential to being healthy. So all he was doing by going to bed was exercising his rights, so that was cool. We had a situation in the UK where a child had gone home and said to his parents, and I should preface this with the parents do get a little booklet on what's going on at the school, or a pamphlet, not a book, little thing. But the one child went home and said, I got into trouble today about something that wasn't my fault, and it happened because the teacher didn't listen to me. And the dad, it was actually the school with all the pregnancies, the dad phoned the principal and he said, you sent home this piece of paper saying my child had rights. One of them was to be listened to. And he said, clearly you weren't listening to my child. Why not? And so the principal called the child in and apologized to him and apologized to the parent. I could go on with positive. I've had one negative comment from a parent, and I'm sure there'd be many more were I in the US, but I've had one negative comment from a parent, and that was in British Columbia. And she said, how dare you tell my child she has rights? I'm a single mother, and my child came home from school and said, I have a right to nutritious food. How do you think I can afford nutritious food, I told her, when I'm a single mother? And you start asking for special food, I'll show you, Missy. And she said, and then my child turned to me and she said, you can't hit me, Mum. I have a right to be protected from abuse. She said, how dare you teach my child this? So I welcome that kind of parental criticism. But just once.
Any other questions or comments? Well, on behalf of the Faculty of Law here at the University of Manitoba. I want to thank you, Catherine, for really interesting and I think challenging talk that, many of us have children, or all of us have been educated in schools, and I think it's given us a lot of food for thought, as well as those of us here in the law school, about the role of rights on the ground, and how do you actually make them meaningful. And so I think you've made a really important contribution here, so thank you. And we have something, I don't know if it's going to fit, but it's a Robson Hall sweatshirt
awesome.
for you to keep you warm.
I needed a hoodie, and it blends. That's great. Thank you. I'll try it.
Something to keep you warm. Thank you.
Okay, try it on.